All right, I'll give a second for everyone to come into this webcast and then we'll get started. So hi everyone, welcome to another Strong Towns webcast. This is an Ask Me Anything session. We're following up with our presentation that Dan Parolek gave on Tuesday, which was focusing on missing middle housing, thinking big and building small to respond to today's housing crisis. Again, I'm Rachel Quedno, Program Director at Strong Towns, and we have Daniel Parolek with us right now. He is the founding principal of Opticos Design and a prominent urban designer and architect working to meet the growing demand for walkable urban living. And most recently is author of a book called Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. So thanks again, Dan, for being here. On Tuesday during that webcast and then in the last couple of days, we've collected a bunch of questions that were submitted in response to that presentation and that conversation about missing middle housing. And so I will just get right started asking some of those and Dan will respond. You can also continue to submit questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen during this presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So let's get started. One of the first questions that came from someone named John is, why is the middle missing? Does the market not demand this? Does zoning not allow it? Have parcels become too small for this sort of housing? How did we get to this missing state?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Rachel, for that introduction, and I'm glad to be back to get a chance to answer these questions. It's always hard in a short presentation Q&A to get the chance to really dive deep into the answers to some of these questions folks have after seeing the presentation. So it's nice to get a chance to have a little bit of extra time to answer these questions. And this question from John is a really good one, and I think it's kind of a foundation. Like you need to be able to communicate the answer to this question in your communities to help at the very beginning of your conversations to build support. And there's absolutely a growing demand for these housing types. As I had shown in a slide, 2/3 of millennials and 1/3 of baby boomers want walkable urban living, and that can be tied specifically to missing middle housing types, a percentage of those according to the study done by Realtor.com, and National Association of Realtors also does similar studies. So the demand is there, but unfortunately there is a tremendous gap between what the market wants and what is being delivered. And as I mentioned on Tuesday, there is a painfully long list of barriers for building missing middle housing that are the reason why it's not being delivered. And I'm going to actually just bring up this slide real quick because I think it's worth people just seeing again to just so I don't want to have to, I won't sort of go through this long list, but just people can sort of jot down some notes. And as I also mentioned, the book was the first time that I really got the chance to dive deep into doing some research on these barriers. And John asked about, is zoning, does zoning not allow it? And I would say that zoning is one of the sort of immediate and initial obstacles. I would say there are very few cities across the country, whether they're small or large, that have zoning that effectively delivers missing middle housing. So the first thing cities need to do is to remove that zoning barrier. But unfortunately, sort of there's other layers of barriers that sort of build upon that. And I think just simple things like the pushback from community members for anything not single family, right? There's additional risks for doing condos in terms of for sale missing middle. One thing I didn't talk about on Tuesday, but there's also there's a building code challenge where when you get to 3 units, you shift from a residential building code to the international building code, which adds additional costs. And often, especially in terms of for sale missing middle, there's challenges to get financing for builders to build missing middle. And it's also a little bit more challenging for buyers to get mortgages for condos as well. And so, yes, there's many barriers, and zoning is one of them. And in terms of parcels being too small, I think it's actually the opposite. It's actually the zoning's not, the metrics aren't right in the zoning to allow missing middle on small lots where they have been built historically. And just as an example, I'm not going to name the city, but we were doing a missing middle scan, analyzing a city's zoning and comparing it to their lot patterns. And they had a lot pattern that was typically 60-foot wide, which is not super small. Anything below 50 gets a little bit more challenging for missing middle, but had a 60-foot wide lot, and it had a medium density zone mapped on it. But that zone had side setbacks of 25 feet for both sides. And so it left 10 feet of developable area on that typical 60-foot lot. And we all know that that's not going to create a viable alternative. And so we see that those sort of very illogical sort of regulations and zoning as a big barrier.
Yeah, sort of building on the barriers question, another question that came from Steve is, how do funders and capital markets feel about missing middle housing? Are the return on investments strong enough to allow for funders to want to support missing middle?
Yeah, another great question. I think I'm finding as I've been more and more active in ULI the past 5 to 6 years, finding that there's actually a really strong interest from capital in investing in this missing middle scale. I would say, unfortunately, there are some actual and some perceived inefficiencies related to the delivery of, a 3, 4, 6, 8 unit building compared to 100 or 100+ unit building. But on the good side is there are creative developers that are figuring out smart approaches where they can address those inefficiencies and find other efficiencies to deliver a project that has good financial returns and a good ROI for investors. One of those projects that I mentioned on Tuesday is the Prairie Queen project. Actually, I might just bring up that slide because I think it's just really good to show this, because it's a really excellent example where a developer got creative with rethinking Class A multifamily and delivering it with missing middle. What's interesting about this, and I think the great thing about this, Jerry Reimer's his name, and Urban Waters is the name of his company, is that he's very happy to share all of the sort of data and financial information about this project so that others can tackle the same challenge. But he's now built 120 units in the first 4 microphases, and they're about 40 units each in buildings that are no more than 8 units per building. And so he's proving that he can deliver good returns on a project that's missing middle. And in this case, it's actually a total of 600 units. So there's some efficiencies in thinking at a neighborhood scale as opposed to that individual lot scale. Now, another project of ours that was the Daybreak Muse, which is also a case study in the book, was built by one of the largest builders in this production builders in the Salt Lake City region. And they had a 8-acre site in a larger master plan community. And they were able to prove, we designed a unique missing middle housing type for them that they were able to deliver at about $25,000 less than a price point of a conventional townhouse, but they were able to achieve the returns that were necessary for them to make that a viable alternative. And they're continuing, the project was very successful for them, and they're continuing to build more of those Muse units. And so I think there's some good examples, unfortunately not a ton of them right now. And if anybody out there has really good examples that we can share on the Missing Middle Housing website to sort of show what types of returns these projects are delivering, I think it'd be great to share that information more broadly.
Awesome. This question came from Susan, who asks, how do you promote missing middle in a suburb where people are concerned that home values will go down with missing middle? Do you think that single family home values would go down if more missing middle housing came into a neighborhood that's predominantly single family?
Yeah, it's another good question. I noticed that a handful of the questions kind of had a similar point of reference to encouraging or building missing middle in um, non-walkable environments. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind when somebody asks a question about a suburb is, like, a lot of questions come to my mind because there are a lot of different types of suburbs. What is the size of the city? How close is that location or neighborhood to a city center, town, a downtown? Is it an early suburb built in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, or is it something built more recently? Because the strategies and approaches would be very different based on the different just physical conditions of those and geographic location of those areas. And the other question I would ask, are there plans in place that the city's done to begin to retrofit certain areas within those suburbs, maybe a corridor? A lot of cities have strategies to infill along their corridors or increase transit. And so I think you have to be very thoughtful about where to enable missing middle. And I'd say that the more suburban you get, the less ideal the location is for missing middle, because the last thing you want to create is density without amenity. Um, uh, but that being said, if it is done thoughtfully, if you enable missing middle thoughtfully in those areas and regulate it very carefully, I don't feel that it's going to impact the property values of those neighborhoods. I feel very strongly that it will not. And when you're thinking about missing middle in more suburban contexts, I also often just note that sort of the further you get out from the center of a city, that's likely the larger the units will need to be acceptable to the market. You'll have to think about providing a little bit more parking. I still don't feel like you need to go to the extreme of a single family suburban parking requirement, making sure your streets have on-street parking. But I think that yeah, I feel pretty strongly that we just need to be thoughtful about it, that it's not going to impact property values if it's done correctly. And it's something that a lot of cities are needing to look at, just based, especially those that are in the higher value real estate markets. And there's just a real crisis with affordability or attainability in those markets.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This question comes from Ben. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but asking the question, is a lot of this conversation about missing middle really focused on ownership and values, home values going up for people who own housing, or is this also really a benefit for renters too? Are there different ways that we should think about missing middle if we're a renter or an owner, or thinking about promoting home ownership versus rentership?
Another great question. I think that we need to be thinking about missing middle both for ownership and as rentals. I think it's important to have a strategy for both, and especially in the affordability conversation. Is not everybody want few, more and more households are choosing to rent by choice, and downsizing baby boomers are part of that. So I think that, yeah, we need to be thinking about both. I think that, cities just need to be, making the changes that are necessary to enable missing middle in the short term and the long term. There was a great report released by Enterprise Community Builders. I'm sure most people know about them. They're a large affordable housing developer called, forgetting the exact name, but if you Google Enterprise Community Partners in small multifamily housing, they did a report about 2 years ago that extracted a bunch of data from the American Housing Survey that showed the role that they did larger than missing middle. I think they capped it at like 40 units per building, but you can extract sort of the smaller buildings out of that data as well. They showed the role that these smaller scale buildings played historically in delivering affordable rental housing. And if we do stop delivering that affordability in the rental housing market, it impacts the market in the short term, but it has larger impacts in the longer term. So yeah, I think it's important to think about missing middle both in terms of for sale and rental. Absolutely.
Got it. A couple of folks asked questions about sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from that very suburban area. What about if your town is really largely built out? Stephanie says, other than one zone in her town, we're going to rezone from commercial and mixed use. The only spots that we have available for new buildings are small parcels that are outside the walkable parts of town. Would it necessarily be a mistake to aim for missing middle in those more spread out spots if that's the only place available to build?
Once again, it's hard to answer that question because there's not a one size fits all solution. And it's part of why we started delivering the missing middle scan service, is to work with cities to do a fairly quick, focused effort outside of a larger comprehensive plan or a sort of larger, more complex planning process, to just dive in, assess their geography, existing patterns, and define where it makes sense to enable missing middle housing, and create a hierarchy of like most important primary, secondary, and tertiary areas where you should be allowing missing middle. I had asked a question. I think part of that question was the city, or the comment to that question was the city's creating mixed use along corridors. And I might stop and ask the question. I see, unfortunately, many cities doing a blanket rezone to mixed use along their corridors, where sometimes the mixed use is not economically viable, and in other instances, like it's just still, the thought is delivering too much ground floor retail space that the market can absorb. So I ask cities, or sometimes challenge them to think, especially along secondary corridors, of maybe some of those environments where the city, before you rezone them for mixed use, is think about maybe there are opportunities for missing middle, especially where there's sort of grayfield sites of low value strip malls or even larger malls that could deliver sort of missing middle and some walkability. And I think that the thing I couldn't tell from this question was, I think cities do need to be thoughtful about where they need to be changing single family zoning to allow missing middle. And it can start in areas, you can map where the missing middle already exists, sort of sprinkled throughout single family areas. But I think that you shouldn't take that completely off the table if your community is completely built out. That sort of starts to raise the question of like, well, what's the next evolution of that city and some of those neighborhoods? And it's a tough conversation to have, but the great thing about missing middle is you can demonstrate that you might be either retrofitting an existing single family house with multiple units, which is more likely to happen, or replacing a single family home with a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, but it would still be in a scale that's compatible with those existing homes. So once again, not a one size fits all solution, but just need to be thoughtful about it, but don't take those single family zones off the table, even though they are challenging. I think most cities need to be talking about that right now, and sort of what the benefits and benefits would be of raising that question and questioning that single family zoning.
Yeah, great. A couple of questions have come in just during this webcast about how to deal with pushback from people who are concerned that increased density is going to create, noise problems, parking problems, just like overload the infrastructure in a community that was previously less dense. How do you know of places that have done a good job of responding to that? Is it just like if there's too much opposition, then just don't even try? Or are there good ways to respond to those concerns?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation on Tuesday, I feel like the primary reason missing middle is caught on is because it has given us the tools to effectively communicate about housing. This seems really, really basic, but we've found it to be invaluable in our practice, starting with an example from 20 years ago when we went out on a walking tour. But take photographs, create a photo catalog of either local or regional missing middle housing types, and either put them on put them on Flickr, organized by building type, or create posters, if in the day and age when we were actually doing public engagement in person. But there's nothing more valuable than having those photographs that people can point to and say, oh yeah, that's on my block. My good friend lives in that, or hey, my son lived in a cottage court just like that, or oh, 10 years ago, I used to live in one of those fourplexes. I really loved it. And I think it personalizes the conversation in a way that you can't without doing that. And so if you combine that with a walking tour, it's even better. That's harder these days as well. But I think cities, cities are starting to step up, states are starting to step up, but I feel like this really has become crisis level in most contexts across the United States. So we need to be having these tough conversations, and there's no better time than the present to start them. And I think what's really nice about sort of tying this back to sort of walkable neighborhoods as well is, and I know Strong Towns is very much about this, but showing that we also cities that are growing can't afford to support the suburban sprawling patterns. And so it does make sense to both support the evolution of existing neighborhoods where there is existing infrastructure, but also if you are allowing new development, but making sure it's happening in a compact pattern. And not an easy thing to do, not an easy policy commitment to take, but now we can point to Minneapolis, we can point to the state of Washington or Oregon, I mean, and so it's great to see that. So I just encourage more cities and more decision makers in cities, because I think it really does need to come from the decision makers to push for this conversation to happen.
Yeah. This question was just submitted by Jesse, who says that he read a research paper and saw a chart in that paper that was talking about how there was a big uptick in the delivery of missing middle and projects with less than 50 units in the 60s and 70s, but then a big decline after that. Do you know about this history? Why would there have been such a big decline in missing middle housing after the 70s?
Yeah, I showed the diagram in my presentation from the American Housing Survey data that shows post 1979, there's a pretty rapid and steady decline of the delivery of missing middle housing. And it's for, it's for a lot of the reasons I mentioned earlier in terms of the barriers. I would say this might be a challenge for the folks that are on the participants today, is I could think of only like a small handful of really great walkable neighborhoods that were actually built after zoning was put in place. So that kind of tells you something, that we did something wrong. The DNA of our zoning was never really intended to deliver, it was intended to deliver suburban, sort of separated suburban environments. And so, part of it was that, and part of it was like we started subsidizing the suburbs, sort of post World War II, made it very attractive and hard to compete with. So it's there, right? All those reasons that I listed, they didn't all happen at once. They sort of all just started happening incrementally, and it's made it harder and harder to deliver. And then sort of back to the question about ROI and sort of return, it's now at the point where it is really hard, if not impossible, for a for sale, in a lot of markets, for a for sale housing project to deliver the same economic benefits or returns as a rental project. And so I think we need to get creative about, well, what are the levers we need to pull to sort of, to make the for sale competitive in terms of returns and attractiveness to investors and developers.
Sort of taking things in a little bit of a different direction, a question came from Mike during the last webcast. Would you speak to the social implications associated with missing middle housing impacts in neighborhoods in comparison to many neighborhoods' kind of status quo development? Yeah, I know you're not like a sociologist, but
no,
I like
that. I like that question. So I like to use my neighborhood here in Berkeley. I live in a neighborhood called Westbury in Berkeley, and so Berkeley, about 20% of the residential lots in Berkeley have missing middle, and the rest are typically small lot bungalows, single family bungalows. And Right next to me, I live in a small lot, 1,000 square foot bungalow with my family of four. It's a little bit tight, but I love my neighborhood. I can't imagine leaving. Right next to me is a duplex, and a friend of mine owns that duplex, and he lives in one unit with his wife and his two young daughters. And on the other side of that duplex lives his aging parents. They're in their sort of mid 70s, sort of just need some assistance on occasion, but like to have that sort of privacy. So they live in that second unit. And I like sort of, that's just an example. And then, just a little bit further down my block is a triplex. And we found out in talking to my son's kindergarten teacher a couple of years ago that she lived in one of those units in the triplex, that her mother, who was also a first grade teacher at the same school, lived in the second unit. And the third unit lived her brother-in-law, who was the PE teacher for my daughter in the middle school down the street. And so I think a big part of this is, right, the status quo pattern is we're going to create a pod of houses that sell for X dollars, another pod that sells for X minus, $10,000, and another pod that's isolated that creates a different sort of price range. And so these really socially isolated sort of pockets, as opposed to this type of middle neighborhood that sort of allows, your teachers, the people who support the businesses that work at the local businesses to actually live in the neighborhood instead of having to get in their car and drive for an hour or more to get there. So I think that's a really big aspect of it. I think it's great. I often joke that you can judge that missing middle neighborhoods probably have the highest quotas of block parties as well, just because they tend to be very tight knit, strong social networks, and right, the types of places where the street gets closed off. We actually, on the next block over, our good friends close off the street every Friday night, and we have a big pizza party. And so that's sort of, I think there's something really invaluable about having that diversity economically, and other diversity in the community, and the middle neighborhoods deliver that.
Yeah,
Rachel, can I ask you
yeah,
this question that I saw pop up in the chat
go
here?
for it. Yeah, there's so many questions
Yeah,
coming in. So
it has a question about that, that they're still concerned that the concept of missing middle is not enough. It's not sufficient enough to truly address sort of the need for climate change reasons, for equity reasons. And I would say that I'm not preaching missing middle to say that it's the only solution. I actually am first and foremost a big proponent of urban places, and feel that yes, bigger and more urban, if you think about it in terms of the transect, the urban to rural transect, yes, there is a need for more housing, more urban revitalization at the upper end of the transect in a T5 or a T6, and missing middle kind of fits in that T4 middle. And I'm not saying that this is it. This is the only solution. Like this just needs to be part of the solution, because we've learned in most cities and even smaller towns, we've learned how to deliver the bigger buildings, and the development communities are delivering. It's this middle that is really missing in almost any context. Majority of cities don't have zoning that enable it. So it needs to be part of the solution. It is important to be thinking about bigger, more urban solutions as well. And I think that's important to emphasize. I'm not saying that I'm not an anti-urbanist. And I feel like with COVID-19 and the sheltering in place, and I think that the demand for these missing middle neighborhoods is going to be higher than it was prior, unfortunately, because it's going to exacerbate the affordability, just because these neighborhoods they deliver the amenities that people want in terms of walkability and access to local coffee shop, bagel shop, small grocery store, but they give just enough elbow room where there's typically a private or a shared outdoor space that you can get outside. And I guess I call it the elbow room. There's enough elbow room to keep people sane in this context. And so I think the demand will only continue to grow.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions and comments come in about the recent Portland zoning reform that just came out a couple of days ago. Do you have any thoughts on that? Someone asks, did that go too far? And yeah, I don't know what your take on is on that, if you've done much
Is it
look at
related to the state of, could you, sorry, I didn't see the question. Is it related to the state of Oregon's or Portland, or what is it specifically?
yes, sorry, Portland. Portland
Portland.
specifically approved a reform to allow more fourplexes, sixplexes on previously only single family lots.
I will say that Portland has had one of the most thoughtful strategies to addressing the enabling of missing middle. And I'm going to show this slide once again, just because it's one of the, I do a short case study of this in the book, and it's just because I've spoken with the Portland staff over the course of the last 4 to 5 years and been on panels with them discussing this. So I think it's really interesting. So they broke it down into two pieces: the residential infill project, which was sort of a more tactical sort of first step, and sort of built up to building support for that. And then this could have changed. I will say that in the last 6 months, I haven't followed it that closely. It sounds like maybe they just adopted this, the better housing by design piece of this, which was allowing the broader range of missing middle and upper missing middle to some of these middle density residential zones. And so I would say is what I saw in Portland's effort, there's a lot to learn from. It was very graphic. The Portland planning staff did a really great job of illustrating kind of what the intent was of these efforts, with some really great graphics to support support the concepts and address the concerns. And it was very thoughtful. And, you know, some people might say it actually took too long, but, you know, they sort of did it over the course of a number of years and built support for it. So I would just encourage anyone to look at it. Now, there might, I don't know how it got changed recently that there might be some criticism of, but I think generally, like, I really liked what I saw, what they were doing, and was very supportive of it. In particular, the way that they effectively communicated the concept with the community, the larger community.
Gotcha. A question that came in from Charles. He asks, I live in a small city, 200,000 people, that appears to be conducting a missing middle housing policy from the top down instead of from the bottom up. Have you seen a missing middle movement in any city succeed if it's led and driven exclusively by local government as opposed to residents?
I would say that it's a really good question. I would say that in most instances, I've seen that the seed has been planted by city decision makers, and then they obviously have a sense that they have enough support within their communities, or have built support or work to build support in their communities. I do feel it is important um, uh, to sort of engage the community and communicate effectively with them. That being said, is you know, cities are having to make some tough decisions, and just the reality of that is not everyone's going to be happy about them. And I think if you can go into a process like that with some good data, with some good illustrations about what the intent is going to be, that I think that's a really good way to build support from those that you have the ability to build support from. So, you know, one of the slides I showed on Tuesday was a yard sign that said, I am missing middle. And I can't remember, maybe somebody online, I can't remember which city. It was a smaller city in the state of Washington that was going through a missing middle housing conversation. And I think what was great about it is the community members sort of organized and started creating a pro missing middle conversation by the creation of that logo, that image, or infographic, I guess is a better way to put it, and started using it in their materials and in yard signs. And I feel like, I mean, the more grassroots support, the better. The more uh, community support sort of starting that process, the better. But what I have, just to be really open and honest, and what I've seen mostly is that city council members sort of bringing that because they realize that it's inevitable for a city to need to address the housing issues, whether it be for equity reasons, for affordability reasons, for city city's economic reasons, just the long-term sort of economic health of a city could be in jeopardy with wrong policies in place, as we're seeing all over the country. So it's a good question, and there was also a group called Neighbors for More Neighbors that I found recently, and they used the missing middle diagram and created a great little. Let me think. It was a great little saying that was: roses are red, violets are blue, missing. Oh geez, I'm not going to remember it now. But it used missing middle housing in a very creative way, in a very fun way, to sort of start people and engaging people in the conversation about missing middle housing. So. There's one other question off the list you sent me, Rachel, which was from Richard, which was: how critical is building form versus principles of scale, entry pattern, facade, and openings? It says, as our communities become more ethnically and racially diverse, is it a problem to adhere exclusively to Eurocentric building forms? And I just wanted to address that one because, first of all, I just wanted to point out that form is not a Eurocentric concept. It's not sort of tied to a specific geographic location. We've done projects in Gabon, Africa, that integrated housing types that were very specific to that climate and culture. I think that's what's just really important. The second thing is that missing middle is style neutral. We're not promoting traditional architecture necessarily. That being said, is what we have found is that part of the reason that most missing middle has been successfully integrated into neighborhoods is it's been very restrained, very simple, and kind of more of a background building than a kind of scream at me, like instead of a building that wants to stand out with 5 materials, a shed roof, and just so I think that's really important. That a message to architects is we do need to practice restraint, because I think that's part of the reason these sort of fit in so well. And I also, that building types, when I sort of show this palette of building types, or if you go to my book and you see this, number one, each of those building types doesn't represent a single design solution. It represents a broad range of solutions, whether depending on your lot size, the context, other requirements, like that type could be unlimited number of different, there could be an unlimited number of design solutions that deliver you to that type. And so I just wanted to address that particular comment and question.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Kind of building off that, Tom asks, how do accessory dwelling units fit into the missing middle? It seems like adding ADUs in existing neighborhoods is potentially less scary to neighbors than other types of multifamily or adding more dense housing. I know that ADUs are in that beautiful image of all the different types of missing middle. But yeah, any specific thoughts on ADUs as part of this type of strategy?
I love ADUs. I'm totally supportive of it. I think I used to have, the missingmiddlehousing.com sort of pellet used to have ADUs, but we actually took them down recently just because we feel that effort has its own momentum and is sort of really being effectively spread across the country. I'm big supporter. I think it's absolutely necessary and completely logical for any city in the country to allow ADUs as part of their housing strategy. But once again, I think it's not enough. You can't stop at ADUs, and I'm afraid that in some ways that ADUs are distracting from the conversation, a much broader conversation that needs to be happen about a broader range of housing types. I think it needs to be part of the solution, just as missing middle is just part of the solution, but you can't stop with ADUs. Big fan of ADUs. Actually, just last night I was over at my neighbor's house, and they're in the middle of constructing their ADU, and they were asking for design advice. So we were I was giving design advice for their ADU over a glass of wine. So I just big proponent, needs to be part of the conversation. We felt it had its own momentum, so we stopped focusing on it because there's a lot of other really great groups and practitioners focusing on it, which is a fantastic point to be at. Hopefully in missing middle, we can say that in another 5 years or less as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have not seen as many like really active campaigns for more like duplexes.
Yeah.
It's needed. Let's see. On Tuesday, Jeff submitted a question. What more can we do for the individual homeowner to encourage them to invest in their home, retrofitting from a single family? to adding missing middle. It seems that we need a financial, ethical, and environmental appeal.
Yeah, I would agree completely. It's just, I think first of all, we just simply need to allow it as a starting point. It seems very basic, but once again, once we allow it, that doesn't mean it's just necessarily going to start to spread, because it is challenging, especially for maybe a property owner who's owned their house for a really long time and may not have a lot of uh, uh, finances to deal with it. I think part of the second strategy, or a strategy, might be then educating those homeowners on the benefits of having a second unit. I mean, maybe it might mean sort of telling the story that they could even move into the second unit and sort of rent out the bigger initial, primary unit as their lifestyle changes, sort of needs change. And I think that, um, then I think there does need to be some financial assistance of some sort. And I will say that I don't know the answer to this, but I feel that um, companies, like we're starting to see companies that are delivering ADUs to, at least here in California, like delivering ADUs to person's backyard, and they pay for the cost, and they have an agreement to share the returns over the course of a period of time, so that they get the returns that they need to make it viable as a company. That's, just thinking creatively of different companies and different small businesses that could help support the spread of those. And I think, you know, hoping that banks can start to be a little bit more open-minded about strategies to create creative financing opportunities for homeowners to maybe use some of the equity in their house in a smart way to sort of divide it up into a second or a third unit. And unfortunately, I haven't seen like a broad strategy on that front yet, but I think it's absolutely necessary for, to address all the issues that you mentioned, whether it be financial, ethical, or environmental, just to get people interested in this. Education is an important part of it. So I would say, like, I'd sort of challenge this group, if you have some tools, have some thoughts, if that financing is your core strength, bring some tools to the table. Maybe you already have, share them with others, that others can use to help spread that. I think it's really important.
Question that recently came in from Emily. She asked, what advice do you have for trying to introduce zoning changes, engage with local stakeholders, and motivate colleagues to invest in this topic for a planning office dealing with limited staff capacity and resources, which I'm guessing is a lot of government offices right now.
Yeah.
Is that a limitation, or are there ways around that?
I think we typically approach it differently based on the capacity of the local staff, whether it be planning staff or the broader city staff. Just acknowledging that they have less capacity than other bigger cities with larger staffs. I would say that one thing I would recommend, and I'm just realizing I haven't spoken about this yet, but it is, one strategy was to begin to build support from the development community. Because, right, the ones who are ultimately going to be delivering this. And I would say that there's been enough publications now through a lot of the journals, Professional Home Builder, National Association of Realtors publications, to begin to illustrate that there is a growing demand for this. I would imagine that most of the builders in the communities are starting to struggle to deliver single family at price points that they can afford to sell them at. Groups like, when we did the missing middle scan in Greenville, South Carolina, a group called Impact Greenville, which was a group of real estate sort of associated entities, are the ones who got together and sort of financed that effort, and to promote the missing middle conversation. It's been really successful. A conversation that has led to second and the third phase of implementation. And so I would say that, start with some education. I think there's enough videos out there now. This one, that Strong Towns included, have your city council members, your planning commissioners watch a missing middle housing video, or hire us or someone else to give a missing middle presentation as a starting point. If you If we can get to the point where we can do walking tours, I would say, right, it's invaluable to get people out, find a neighborhood that has a couple of blocks with missing middle, talk about what they are, what they're not, why they shouldn't be scary, what would need to be done with zoning to enable them. So those are some of the strategies, sort of initial sort of steps I would recommend. And I systematically walk through those in the book. I thought that was one of the things that was really important, is to talk both about not just the immediate zoning changes, but like how do you build up to a point where you get enough support from a community and from a city to get to the point of having support to change your zoning. I do encourage you to take a look at that as well.
Thank you. So I know that you've mentioned before, and that you've worked with the ARP a little bit, and that like aging in place can be a really important factor to think about and a reason to encourage missing middle. Someone asked a specific question about whether there's been movements to build using universal design that's specifically intended for folks of different abilities and ages to be able to use a space. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or just general thoughts on why this is particularly valuable for folks who are aging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not only important for the folks who are aging, but important for the cities who are trying to enable this, because as I showed, Chris Nelson did some great research for chapter 2 of my book on illustrating the demand and building the case for the demand. Actually, this would be another bit of information to use in sort of building support, but he showed that sort of the foundation is between 2010 and 2040, that 77% of household change in the demand for housing is going to be driven by households over the age of 65 or 65 and over. And right, that in and of itself is like, it'd be completely ridiculous for you to not then address accessibility and universal access. So I think you just absolutely something you need to be very thoughtful about. And any developer doing this should be thinking about sort of who their target market is and designing accordingly. And I think that's a big component of it. So it's, yeah, absolutely should be part of the conversation, the missing middle conversation in every community across the country. It is really important. And I would just mention that I would say just one really basic thought is, the closer a building gets to the sidewalk, the more privacy issues you begin to have. So it becomes a little bit of a design challenge, but that I know most architects can figure out, is how do you deliver privacy if a building sort of lowers itself the sidewalk level in that ground level unit. So it's just something designers, architects need to be thoughtful of, but it's absolutely addressable through thoughtful design, and it's something that should be part of the missing middle discussions.
So this is a pretty specific design question, but we're on the design side, so I'll go for it. This comes from Ethan, who says, in Oregon, we are going the way of tying the scale, bulk, siting, design regulations of middle housing types to the same standards that apply to single family. Are there specific siting or design standards like setbacks, building height, minimum lot size that you feel should be different for missing middle housing versus for single family detached, that might help facilitate an increase in middle housing production?
It's a hard question to answer, just because every single family zoning district is a little bit different. I would say that based on our work across the country, in most markets, if you require more than one off-street parking space per unit, it's going to be really hard to make especially in infill context, to make the missing middle pencil out. So reducing your parking requirements is a really big part of this. The Prairie Queen project provided one off-street parking space per unit, and on-street parking delivers the rest of the parking. So I think that's a really great strategy. And what our client is finding is that people love to park at the curb right in front of their front door and walk up to their front door, as opposed to parking in a garage at the back. So parking is one. I can guarantee that minimum lot sizes in most zoning codes are too large. They assume that, if a single family house fits on a 5,000 square foot lot, you should bump that up to a 10,000 square foot lot for 2 units. And that's the exact wrong mentality. any lot as a starting point that is 50-foot wide. So we often, well, we always promote that instead of using minimum lot sizes, tie it to a lot width, because we feel any lot that is 50 foot or wider should allow a fourplex. And so part of this strategy is like, if you don't have the capacity in your local planning staff, hire a local architect firm or collaborate with the local AIA and take 3 or 4 typical lot sizes in each of the different zones you're looking at and do the ideal missing middle build out, and then reverse engineer your zoning code based on that design solution. Because I can guarantee, its density is probably too low, setbacks are probably too large. So those are the sorts of things. The other thing is that the reason that regulating the maximum building width is so important is because if you have a small lot, it already regulates that maximum width, but that's at a point where somebody aggregates lots or they get a bigger lot, the last thing you want them to do is to build a really out of scale building. You want to build them multiple smaller buildings to deliver that missing middle scale. So that would be a starting point. I would say that both on missingmiddlehousing.com and in my book, that's why we delivered the tables of the metrics for each of the building types for front-loaded conditions and rear-loaded, because it gives all that data that isn't the right solution for every city in every zoning district, but it's a really good starting point for some of those changes, informing some of those changes.
Got it. We had a couple questions come in from people in college towns specifically, and kind of wondering about some of the concerns that longtime homeowners might have that these sorts of greater allowances for multifamily housing will just result in like a bunch of partying college kids. So like how do cities, address that question? Someone said, how do we level the playing field between student housing and already existing residential communities? Have you worked with any college towns on missing middle work?
Yeah, I think the college town adds a whole nother layer of complexity to this conversation. Part of why the answer can't just be the one size fits all. We've worked with a number of towns and cities that have universities. The one that kind of comes to mind immediately is Norman, Oklahoma, where the University of Oklahoma is. And we were hired to look at the area with a larger team between the university and the downtown. And we see this in every other college town we work in, right? The issue is that a lot of times national student housing developers sort of come into town with the same big boxy student housing project that they've built in a bunch of other places. And the first one gets built and it sort of raises the flags in people's minds. They can see that marching through the neighborhood. So as part of a strategy is just, thinking about, where those big buildings make sense, because the likelihood is the demand is probably high enough that you need some of those bigger student housing projects. But then thinking about where the missing middle scale, like in Norman, they served as a transition from those bigger buildings into the single family neighborhoods. And we're also doing similar work in Iowa City, Iowa. I would say that there's unfortunately no one really great sort of silver bullet solution, and it really varies based on state law in a lot of instances of what you're actually allowed to regulate. So I unfortunately don't have like the perfect answer, but I think you just need to be thoughtful about it. I think there is a role for missing middle in those transition areas. I think that it is going to be really hard in a lot of instances. So what we saw in Iowa City, for example, is that the zoning code was encouraging the construction of like 5-6+ bedroom either townhouses or single family units, because it was still one unit. And the second you enable the delivery of more smaller units, it's likely that developer is going to start to attract a different type of renter or even buyer in some instances, where a more sophisticated grad student or a or a faculty member that would love to live in a small 1-bedroom or even a studio apartment and not share a place with, 8 other students. And so it just, once again, just need to be thoughtful about it. Not a perfect solution, but you could look at those examples and see what they delivered and sort of see if some of those solutions might apply to your context.
Yeah, I appreciate your emphasis on the fact that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions in this sort of work. We have to look at our own communities and see what's going to work best there.
Yeah, because I think that's partly a big reason why we got into this problem in the first place is, right, one city adopted a zoning code and then the next city over sort of picked it up and said, I'm just going to take those metrics and apply them to my city. And that just sort of exponentially spread. And there was never any local or very little local calibration in those zoning. And I tell people in the context of form-based coding is the biggest difference, and it's often not communicated between form-based coding and conventional zoning, is that you go in and you study that existing context and the pattern, and you actually adjust the zoning based on those existing patterns instead of applying standards that were borrowed from another place. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is now some form-based codings that are unfortunately taking that same strategy of just copying metrics from other form-based codes, and it's not the right way to approach it. So it's just something that's good to be thinking about.
Yeah, so okay, we'll just do one final question here because we're almost finished with the hour. Amber asked, given the recent guidelines and need for social distancing, do you see the increase in desire for more walkable communities and shared spaces to continue? This moment that we're in, is it a time for more walkable neighborhoods, missing middle housing?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the missing middle neighborhoods are a real sweet spot for a response and sort of delivering sort of healthy living for related to COVID. And I wrote, if you Google missing middle housing and US News and World Report, I just wrote an article for US News and World Report on this topic. And just, I feel really strongly that these neighborhoods are performing really well in COVID, sort of that giving people that elbow room that they're sort of craving. You can walk out your door and not have to worry about sort of stumbling over somebody or keeping that 6-foot distance. And I think an important part of it is, it's population densities that support the local services, commercial services, the bagel shops and such. But it's also population densities that support public transportation. And I know that, right, they're discouraging the use of it unless it's absolutely necessity. But I think that's really important for those people who, right, don't own a car and don't have other means of getting around to have that access to the public transportation, to get to their jobs, and more importantly, to get to healthcare. And I think that the middle neighborhoods also support enough population density to have a good network of healthcare, easy access. And so, and I'm also writing a similar article for Wired magazine that will be out shortly. So I just encourage you to, I think the demand prior to COVID was growing and there was a gap in supply. I think it's only going to continue to grow. And unfortunately, I think it's going to exacerbate the affordability and even displacement conversation. So I think it's even more important for cities to sort of bring this to the table and to be being very thoughtful and diligent about understanding how they can play a role in delivering more missing middle housing in their communities.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for taking the time to answer so many of these questions. Thanks to everyone for thinking through these issues in your place, and I hope you're all going to go out and start implementing them in your communities.
Hey, Rachel, can I just show one more slide here?
Yeah, go for it.
I just want to make sure, because it is, I do feel that, the presentation in this conversation just really just touched upon the content in the book. And I was really thrilled to get a chance, after talking about this for 8+ years, to actually get a chance to document my thoughts and many of the the points I've been making in presentations. And it was a great pleasure to work with Island Press on the book. And like, I was surprised they're giving this 30% discount if you use the code webinar. Like, that's a pretty substantial discount. I think it comes out right at about $30 or under, which is a pretty good deal. So just encourage people to buy the book, but also if you have, I won't be able to respond immediately to every question, but feel free to send me an email if you have a burning question. I'm really passionate about this topic and thrilled that Strong Towns gave me the opportunity to sort of discuss this with the Strong Towns Network, and would be happy to follow up with some of you who have some follow-up questions that we didn't get a chance to talk about.
Yeah, thank you for being so generous with your time.
Yeah.
And to everyone attending, we'll be sending out a link to the recording and again, a link to this book with the discount code for everyone to hopefully benefit from. So yeah, thanks so much, Daniel. Thanks everyone for attending. Take care.
Rachel.